we'll begin the proceedings this morning. My name is Chris Brandwood from the British Council, and it's my great pleasure to be introducing this morning Professor Penny Orr, who is now a retired professor from Oranim University, or Oranim Academic College of Education and Haifa University, although she confided to me this morning that since her retirement she's seems to have been working more than ever, and in fact wishes that she could return to full-time work. But you'll probably have gathered that Penny Orr has 30 years experience as an English teacher, particularly has 30 years of classroom practitioner experience in elementary schools, middle schools, high schools, and this has been in Israel where she lives. Now retired, she's taught MA courses at Oranim Academic College of Education at Haifa University. She's presented papers at the big conferences for TESOL, IATEFL, and many, many other English teacher conferences worldwide. And I think this is her third visit to India, and has been to Delhi, I think, and Chennai before, but never to Hyderabad. Professor Orr has published a number of articles and was for 10 years the editor of the Cambridge Handbooks for Language Teachers series. Her books include a very famous book which I used when I first started teaching called Discussions That Work, 5-Minute Activities, which was co-authored with Andrew Wright, a course in English language teaching, grammar practice activities, vocabulary activities, and a course in English language teaching. All are published by Cambridge University Press, who have kindly sponsored this session this morning. So without further ado, I will hand over to Professor Orr. Thank you very much.
Just checking for sound. Can you hear me? Good. Okay. Well, thank you very much for that introduction, and I'm really glad to be back in India. Thank you very much to the organizers of the conference for inviting me, and to Cambridge University Press for making it possible for me to come. It's quite a long way from Israel. And I flew in on Thursday, spent yesterday sightseeing in Hyderabad, which was absolutely lovely, and now all set to enjoy the conference with all of the people here. The aspect of diversity which I'm going to look at is not diversity of population, so much as diversity of sources of knowledge of the teacher, and specifically the role of research, which has been somewhat controversial for a number of reasons, which I'll go into. Two major questions I'm going to ask. Firstly, what is the situation today with regard to the use of research as a source of knowledge for practitioners? And secondly, where do we go from here? So after sort of painting a picture of what I see as the present situation, I'll ask what we can do about it, how we can progress from that situation. So first of all, then, the situation today. Sources of teacher knowledge are the following. If you ask teachers how they learned to be teachers, they'll say things like, well, my courses, I learned courses, pre- and in-service courses, preparation, and then later courses while I was teaching. Conferences like this one, or local conferences, reading, research, professional literature, recommendations of colleagues or discussions with colleagues. So I talk to other English teachers and learn from that. Feedback from students, what I've learned from my own students. And finally, classroom experience, my own classroom experience and reflection. Now, on several occasions, I've had opportunities to ask audiences of teachers which of these, in their opinion, was the most significant, important source of knowledge for their present expertise. And without exception, the answer was the last item. Teachers, by a large majority, say, well, the main way I learned to be a teacher was by teaching and finding out what worked, what didn't work, and learning from my own experience. Schoen, the reflective practitioner, a book published some time ago, 1983, but a seminal work, puts his finger on this, this point and says that professionals learn mainly by reflecting on inaction, as they are actually teaching, then on action when they leave the classroom later and go out and think about it, and not by applying research-based theories. The classic model of teaching teachers, their profession has been or was to teach all sorts of theories and say, okay, go into the classroom and apply them. And Schoen said, well, it doesn't actually happen like that. The contrast, however, in the literature you see on teacher education to this day, and this is a fairly recent publication by a very well-known Finnish professor of education, who says that the teaching profession, as with all high-standard professions, needs the best available academic knowledge in order to fulfill its commitments. Teachers have to be familiar with the latest knowledge and research about the subject matter. The aspect of research continues to be emphasized in the literature. And if you look at definitions of courses, here's a course from University of Maryland, 2009. And note, the goal of this introductory course is to help practicing and prospective teachers. It is not presented as an academic course, but as a professional tools course. So to understand and explore the complex world of second language acquisition. And the last sentence, students will critically examine foundational theories and research perspectives in the field of second language acquisition. And this is seen as a basic teaching course. Side by side with this, there has been increasing academicization of the field of English teacher education. First of all, courses which used to be, when I did my teacher training, it was at diploma level. You just did a year's course or a 6-month course and you got your qualification to be an English teacher. But today, in many places in the world, including India, the courses for teachers' professional preparation is at the university level, academic degrees at BA and MA level, and indeed doctoral level. And another interesting piece of evidence that backs up this trend towards becoming more academic is the trend towards research-based articles of TESOL Quarterly. TESOL Quarterly, the main journal of TESOL International, which when it was set up in 1967, published mainly practical tips and ideas and articles rather like the ones that are today published in journals like English Teaching Professional, ideas, recipes, and so on, and has become increasingly academic until today. You can't really publish in TESOL Journal unless in TESOL Quarterly unless the article is research-based with a solid academic foundation. But what about practicing teachers? Well, most practicing teachers do not read the research literature. Ones who are actually in practice practitioners during their ongoing work, they do not read the research literature very often, if at all. The reasons they give are various, and there has been research on this as well. I don't have the time, that's the main one. I don't have access. How do I get at it? Not of practical help. The research literature is too theoretical. It doesn't actually give me practical ideas, and it's difficult to understand. Simon Borg's research of 2009. I'll give you the references later. In fact, I have a Word version of this presentation with all the references, and I will later ask the organizers if I can put it up online so that everyone can download if they so wish. The first time I gave the first version of this, this talk at one of the conferences, a teacher came up to me and said, my employer, she worked in a language school, she said, my employer actually said to me, I don't want you to waste your time going to conferences or reading the literature. I want you to spend your time teaching. That's what you're employed for. She says that the teachers are actually, in some cases, discouraged from this kind of professional education, reading, and particularly going into the literature. Then at some stage there was a suggestion that the teachers themselves should be doing research in order that the research should be more relevant. Okay, to solve this problem of relevance, let's have teachers themselves doing research on their own classrooms and publishing it. Started with Lawrence Stenhouse many years ago in the 1970s. He tragically died young, but he published some seminal papers and books. Teacher research, he called it, is disciplined inquiry made public. So teachers should be inquiring into their own classrooms and publishing, making available to the public, later called action research. But it hasn't happened. Teachers simply are not doing the research. They don't have the time, basically for the same reasons as we saw before. They don't have time, they don't have their job description does not allow for it. Their time is taken up preparing and giving lessons. There's no way they can also do research, let alone write up and publish. Other options, all rights, exploratory practice, an attempt to solve this problem, but again, it hasn't happened. So we don't really have a body of teacher research available to the practitioner, and the teachers do not read the available academic research. So, just to sum up what I've said up to now, reflection on experience rather than research-based theory is seen by practitioners as the main source of knowledge. But on the other hand, study of the research continues to be included in the literature and in courses. In general, a trend toward academicization of teacher education. Teachers do not usually read the research, and they do not normally do research themselves. Now, if we put all that together, what we are seeing here is an uncomfortable conflict or difference or dissonance. Because on the one hand, you've got the academics saying, yes, you should, the research is absolutely basic and crucial and everybody should be reading it. And on the other hand, the teachers saying, well, we can't, we don't. So a difference between academic and practitioner views of research-based theory. This is not, incidentally, only English teaching. A lot of professions, medicine is another example, architecture, law, psychology, a lot of the professions have the same sort of dissonance between what the academics are saying and what the practitioner is saying. There is rising awareness of this dissonance and increasing discussion in the literature and at conferences. Particularly Ellis, two publications here, a book and an article, and discussions also last year at IETFL in the Research SIG exactly on this issue. Okay, so where do we go from here? Well, I want to touch on a few points here. First of all, I want to make the point that research, even if teachers say, I don't have time, it's not relevant, and so on, nevertheless, in my opinion, research does have a substantial contribution to make to professional knowledge, and I'll be giving some examples. What are the problems in making use of this research, even given that teachers can find the time? What are some problems? And what are some solutions within teacher education programs and for the practicing teacher from the perspective of the English teacher educator? So, okay, a substantial contribution. I think that English teaching research on English teaching can make a substantial contribution in various ways. Firstly, there are different types of research-based literature. There is the original empirical research, the classic model of one class is taught one way, another class is taught another way, and you see which class learned better using some kind of differing techniques. You try to put your finger on what was the better, the more advantageous technique or procedure for the bringing about of learning of the language. So that's the research, the empirical research. And then we get overviews and meta-analyses more and more appearing in the journals, where the researcher does not do any research him or herself, but takes a whole set of research studies on a particular topic, does an overview, does a meta-analysis using careful statistical techniques, and comes to some conclusions about what in general is the research-based theory or model that appears to predominate. Finally, there are articles which are proposing new theories or models of language teaching or aspects of language teaching, and simply using the research evidence as the basis for these ideas. Okay, how does it contribute? Well, research produces evidence. That's the main thing. Evidence that can be used to create practical principles for teaching. It produces evidence beyond what I can encounter in my own classroom. My own experience is important. We saw it's absolutely crucial. But it is only my own experience. I can expand it a little bit by asking colleagues, if I want to go beyond my own and my colleagues' experience, I have to look outside. I have to look at the literature, and this is where I can find evidence from classrooms different from my own. So this evidence may provide insights or information that hadn't occurred to me, okay, things which I simply hadn't come across, and here is a source where I can find new ideas or insights which I hadn't come across. And quite importantly, it may contradict comfortable but inaccurate assumptions. I may assume that, oh yes, we should teach this way, this is what works, and then I see a piece of research which shows that actually it doesn't work, or in other situations it doesn't work, and maybe I ought to rethink my use of this particular aspect. On the more comfortable side, it may simply confirm my own intuitions. I'm doing it right. Look, here's some research which shows that other teachers also have the same experience and are succeeding the same way. I am using the similar techniques and procedures. Let me give some examples. Incidental vocabulary acquisition from reading. I happen to be particularly interested in vocabulary, so a couple of my examples here are from vocabulary at the moment. There is overwhelming evidence that in most ELT contexts, incidental learning of vocabulary through reading will not lead to satisfactory levels of vocabulary knowledge. You need what's happening in most situations where English is learned in classrooms, in formal studies in schools, is that students simply do not have the time to read the enormous amount of text that you need in order to acquire a large vocabulary. Speakers of their own language, mother tongue learners, learn their vocabulary mainly through reading. So that's the natural way to learn, and the way we learn, we amass the huge vocabulary we have in our mother tongue. For students who are in school and who are not learning in an environment which is totally English speaking, so this perhaps would not apply to the English medium schools, but it would apply to learners of English in all other kinds of state schools around the world. They simply do not get enough reading input, and therefore we need to teach vocabulary through vocabulary teaching procedures. Even if they are reading quite a lot, I think vocabulary teaching procedures are also important and contributory. Example 2, semantic sets, and this is an example of counterintuitive research. Teaching new items in semantic sets does not result in optimal learning. So if you teach, as many of our elementary, or I have to correct myself here, the elementary school books in Israel where I teach Most of them, the early chapters, are devoted to let's learn all the animals or all the parts of the body or all the colors. So you've got a semantic set or a lexical set such as red, yellow, green, blue, brown, and so on. And there is very clear evidence that teaching students sets of adjectives of all the same kind of thing or nouns of all the same kind of thing, parts of body, does not lead to very good learning. There's original research done by Tinkham back in the 1990s and then replicated by 3 or 4, in fact 4 researchers that I know of which this is the latest, the one you have up on the screen, shows that students, if you give students a set of words to learn, all of which mean the same kind of thing, and you give a control group a set of words to learn which all come from different areas, such as, say, cloud, frog, car, go, no connection between them, they will actually learn the second set better. When the subjects were asked why this is, they said, well, we got a bit confused because they all mean the same kind of thing and we didn't find it very helpful. Learning new items, in fact, if you learn new items in, as it were, syntagmatic, with syntagmatic links, they will learn them better. So that means things like learning blue with sky, because blue goes with sky in natural contexts, as opposed to blue with red. Blue does not necessarily go with red in a natural context. And this is interesting insights, counterintuitive, which made me, anyway, rethink my own teaching when I was teaching in elementary school and the materials I was using. Example 3, corrective feedback, oral corrective feedback in this case. Recasts are the least effective oral corrective feedback strategies. What I mean by recast is that if someone says, I speak to a student and say, what are you doing? And the student says, I sitting. And I respond by saying, I am sitting. That is a recast. I'm simply saying their sentence back to them in its correct form. And it is the most common form of corrective feedback given in most classrooms, apparently, according to Lister. But it is also the least effective. One of the reasons may be that recasts are sometimes not perceived as corrections at all. They're perceived as echoes or confirmations. Little story. I went to a lecture by Rod Ellis. I don't remember what the topic was, but he threw up on the screen a little dialogue of a teacher teaching in a language school in southern England, a set of adults, and he was practicing the past tense, and he asked in a communicative way, and he asked the students, what did you do last night? And one of the students raised his hand and said, I go to the pub. England, right? And the teacher says, I went to the pub. And the student says, yes, I go to the pub. In other words, he had not perceived the correction. He just perceived the confirmation or the understanding. And this may be a reason why recasts are not very effective. But then we have to think about, okay, if I'm not going to recast, what am I going to do? And the answer is some way, negotiate with the student, elicit from the student, explain to the student, go into the mistake a little bit more deeply, and make sure that the student has actually taken on board what the correct form should be. Some problems with all of this, with using the research literature. I've shown that a lot of research studies can be a very practical application to the classroom, very useful for teachers. They don't use it very much for various reasons, apart from the time, which I've already mentioned, at accessibility. There are actual problems with the research itself. First of all, it's very often not clear, not written clearly enough. There are contradictions between different studies sometimes. And the practical application may be limited or inappropriate for various reasons. because there's a small population or time frame, something called the Hawthorne effect, which I'll explain in a moment, local pedagogical or practical constraints, and inadequate professional experience of the researcher. Well, I just want to go into these a little bit more detail. First of all, lack of clarity. I tell my students when they're reading on a master's program, if they are reading an article, a research article, and they can't understand it, the reason is likely to be the writer's fault, not theirs. A lot of research articles are written in very opaque language, very difficult to understand. Sometimes this is inevitable because you do need, in some cases, specific, precise terminology for what you're talking about. The statistics may be necessary but difficult to understand. But often, it's unnecessary, gratuitous, and unforgivable. There's a reference here to an article by Aronson about scientific articles. So it's not just English, it's all sorts of academic articles which tend to go for rather formal, difficult language, perhaps in order to make an impression, or I don't know, to get accepted by a very high prestige journal. But there is a problem of lack of clarity in a lot of academic language. Orwell had these marvelous set of maxims. Never use a metaphor, simile, or other figure of speech, which you're used to seeing in print. In other words, don't use cliché. Never use a long word where a short one will do. If it is possible to cut a word out, always cut it out. Never use the passive where you can use the active. Never use a foreign phrase, a scientific word, or a jargon word if you can think of an everyday English equivalent. And finally, break any of these rules sooner than say anything outright barbarous. And I always remember this, looking through my own writing. Could I say this more briefly? Do I really need this sentence? Would a simpler word do? And so on. Anyway, the next point was contradictions. Example, the role of practice, for example, in instructed language learning. Two articles both by accredited, respected researchers, one of whom says practice is really useful and important, and the other says practice is pretty useless. So you decide which you want, and it's really confusing for the teacher having to look at these different things and see different research-based theories. Limited practical application. I want to spend a little time talking about the various aspects of this. First of all, small population. A lot of the research is done on very small classes, typically done on university students because for the academic researcher, these are the populations who are most readily accessible. So they're going to use classes of English EAP classes within their university, who may or may not be, the results from which may or may not be relevant to my classes of teenagers or children. Very often relatively short time, number of hours. The studies, for example, quoted in a seminal overview article by Norris and Ortega, most of these studies were very short and with very small populations. The Hawthorne effect comes from a story of a factory in the United States in the 1950s. And the factory had a production line where the workers were producing something, I forget even what it was now. And the researchers wanted to see that if they changed the lighting, if that would produce better production. The factory is a place called Hawthorne, that's why it's called the Hawthorne effect. And they changed the lighting and production went up. So they wrote this down, okay, the different lighting produces better production. But as time went on, the effect went down a little bit. And then they said, okay, let's try and change the lighting back to what it was before. They changed it back to what it was before, and production went up again. In other words, the difference that the intervention made may have been simply because there was intervention. and because the subjects of the research knew that they were being experimented on, knew that they thought that the experimenter wanted to see if this would make an improvement, and this actually motivated them to improve. And it was not the actual quality of the change itself which made the difference. So impressive results in an empirical study may be simply the result of change and the subject's awareness that this is an experimental innovation. Particularly interesting, I think, in the research on the use of CAL, computer-assisted language learning, which typically is based on let's do something without using computers, and then another class using computers and see the difference. And very, very often the difference is in favor of the computer use, but we don't know yet if in another 10 years this would be true when people are used to computers and they take them as routine. Maybe if those classes then went back to using pencil and paper, maybe then learning would go up again because it's new and it's interesting. We don't know. And therefore, research based on an innovation which the students, the subjects are aware is an innovation, something new, and which has only been going on for a short time, we need to relate to with caution. It may be right. It may be quite true that it's a positive innovation, but it may not, and we need to be careful about this phenomenon. Pedagogical practical constraints. The published research on ELT is nearly all second language acquisition. I just want to take you back to a previous slide here. If you remember this slide here about the course at Maryland, it's all about second language acquisition research, assuming that second language acquisition research is the basis for learning about second language teaching. Spada, an article which has not actually been published on paper yet, it's only available on the internet, puts her finger on this, says that most of the research that teachers are asked to read is second language acquisition, and questions how far this is relevant and important. But practical pedagogical issues are often more important to practitioners. In other words, what interests me as a teacher may not be the best way a learner acquires language under laboratory conditions or in a controlled experiment. What affects the way I teach very often is things like I have a large heterogeneous class and I have to use techniques which will activate students, and these are the things which concern me. I'll be talking about this in coffee shop this afternoon. Discipline problems. I may choose some procedures rather than others because of discipline problems. Do you have discipline problems in India? Not so bad. Not so bad here. In some countries in Europe, this is a real problem. Where I come from, it's a problem, and the teachers need to take that into account. Pressure from stakeholders. The parents of my students are expecting me to teach in a particular way. The head of the school is expecting me to teach in a particular way, and therefore these are things which will affect, inevitably, the way I teach. Upcoming exams. What's going to be in the exam? Again, that's going to be more important than second language acquisition research. The local culture of learning. How well the students learn in different ways, because that's the way they're used to learning, and that is the way it's always been done. That's the way their parents learned, and that's the way they feel they learn best. This is also going to affect my decisions as a teacher. Limited time to prepare. I'm not going to give examples of all of these, just one or two of them. There are lots more, of course. The culture of learning is an interesting one. Task-based or communicative teaching has come in as the modern orthodoxy, as it were. It's the way we're supposed to be teaching, using tasks, using communicative techniques. And what is happening is that in some cultures of learning, that just doesn't work. particularly in the Far East, these two pieces of research talking about China and Hong Kong. The students simply do not respond well, and they don't feel they learn well using very task-based or communicative teaching. And the response of the researchers was that we need to find some kind of compromise, some kind of way of making, of taking into account the culture of learning, the way the students are used to interacting in a classroom, the way they see the teacher and the teacher's function, and so on. Stakeholder pressure. The example I'm going to give here is the optimal age for starting to study English in school. In a situation where students only have 2 or 3 lessons a week in schools, I'm not sure this is true of many places in India, but certainly in Europe, Latin America, and other places in the world, in such places it has been found that starting English earlier does not actually help, and that late starters learn better. There's some very interesting research done in immersion situations in Canada. It was found that students who learners of French who were English speaking but learning French in French schools and came into the French schools at grade 1, as compared to a group who came in and started learning French in grade 7, it was found that when they were tested at grade 12, they had acquired more or less the same level of French as regards reading, writing accuracy. The only place where the early starters had a little superiority was confidence and fluency. But their overall knowledge of vocabulary, their ability to express themselves, their accuracy particularly, was no better. And in some cases, the late starters actually were superior. I haven't got the reference for this. This is Swain. I will try and get it and add it. But certainly in recent research done, particularly in Barcelona, this was found to be true, that the early starters did not have any advantage. And in fact, there's quite a body of opinion which says that what is important at the early stages is for the student to become literate and fluent in their mother tongue and to learn the basic numeracy and cultural studies and socialization, and it is okay to start English a bit later. However, and I say I'm not sure that this applies to some situations in India, particularly in the English medium schools. I'm talking here about Europe, Latin America. What's happening in Europe and Latin America is that the pressure of parents, politicians, and commercial interests bring the age down, even though the research says something else. So it's the stakeholder pressure which brings about the decisions. Then there's the inadequate professional knowledge of the researcher. Many researchers, academic researchers, never actually taught English. Some of them did. Some of them did, some of the best ones did, but a lot of them never did, or they did so long ago they've forgotten what it was all about. And they are writing about something they have no immediate experience of. So what happens is that at the end of an article, very often a research article, you get to the researcher saying, these are the practical pedagogical implications of my research, and they are often, in fact, impractical. What I have learned is I very often skip that section of a research article I'm reading, read the research, very often very good, solid, interesting research, and then skip their conclusions and draw my own. Sorry. Many excellent studies followed by off-the-wall suggestions for classroom teaching. And the implication of this, as pointed out by Widdowson and Ellis, practical implication of research to teaching has to be determined by the practitioner, by the teacher, not by the researcher. The researcher supplies the information, the evidence, the ideas, and their application to teaching. has to be done by the teacher or indeed the teacher educator. Finally, some possible solutions that I think. First of all, teacher preparation programs. I'm looking at how can we make the research more accessible to teachers, allow teachers, facilitate the use of research and insights from the research for the practitioner. Well, first of all, in teacher preparation programs, in the diploma and BA or BEd programs, which normally consist of these various aspects, the experiential work, which is the same as giving them some sort of reflection on experience to start off the gut feeling for how the teaching works, then input from us, from the teacher educators, practical theory of good teaching in general, and language teaching in particular, tips and recipes, ideas which I have, which I want to share with my students, and their underlying rationales. Research-based theory I can also give them, and the reflection and collaborative critical discussion, because all of these, the input, the practical input and the theoretical input and the research and everything, need to be subjected then to collaborative discussion and criticism by the teachers, the trainees, and the teacher educator. I've highlighted this item in red because all the others are accessible to the teacher after they start work. They're going to carry on thinking about the theory. They're going to carry on, well, I hope they'll carry on thinking about the theory through the practice. They'll certainly get the teaching practice and observation. They'll certainly get tips and practical ideas from their textbooks, from teacher handbooks, from colleagues, and they'll carry on with their personal reflection. What they will not get is access to the research-based literature. What can we do about that? I think that the important thing is to say that within the teacher preparation courses, we do need to emphasize the aspect of the research, because this may be the last chance the teachers will get of having access to useful studies, useful research-based theory, and also the idea how they can carry on, the encouragement to carry on reading such literature. So I think that this kind of thing does not, the input based on the research needs to be emphasized in our teacher education preparation courses. So as a teacher educator, I can provide, these are references, texts, this is where you can find them. I can mediate the difficult texts, help them to understand them. I can facilitate critical discussion of the material. I can link it or suggest how it might be linked to practice, or encourage the members of my class to think about how they can link it to practice. Finally, I can be a role model myself. I'm reading research, I find it really interesting. I can try and communicate my own enthusiasm, interest to the members of my class. Ongoing practitioner access to the research. We've said before that the main problems are finding time, getting access, the fact that the research is very often, or appears to be, of no practical use, and its comprehensibility. Well, time and access, to a large extent, has been solved by the contribution of the internet. Time was, if I wanted to read an academic article, I had to go to Haifa University, which is an hour-and-a-half's drive from my home, and spend the morning leafing through journals there. Today, I can access most articles at the click of a mouse through Google Scholar, and it's made an enormous difference, and teachers need to be aware how easy it is to access interesting articles by typing in keywords to Google Scholar and clicking. National and international conferences, another thing we can do is encourage teachers to attend conferences, national, international, local, just little in Israel, we have a phenomenon called the mini-conference, which is just a local conference of a dozen schools in the area, in the local area, where they come together and share ideas, or maybe invite a speaker from not too far away who can talk to them. So conferences are another way we should encourage our teachers to access the research. And finally, practical use and comprehensibility, the problem of studies which appear to be not relevant because they are not very practical, or they're just difficult to understand. I think we need here to empower teachers, and I'm going to come on to that in a moment. You choose what you read, and you criticize it and decide what you will accept and what you will reject from it. What we can do to help then. First of all, we can act as mediators, empower, and give tips. Mediators, I see myself as a mediator. Mediators are teachers who are also teacher educators, readers of research, and writers. So I am in a position, because I'm a classroom teacher, I'm also a teacher educator, I'm also fairly widely read. I am in a position to mediate the research literature to other teachers through various sources. I can write books, I can write articles, I can do YouTube recordings, I don't happen to do a blog, but there are other mediators, people I would call mediators, people like Jeremy Harmer and others who do marvelous blogs which teachers can read and access the research through them, conference presentations and so on. Secondly, empowerment. We can tell the teachers, you are the one to decide. You don't have to read what I'm telling you, but you can read this, and it is you who decide whether it is worth reading and what you will do with it. Check if it's readable, read it. If it's incomprehensible, skip it. It's probably the writer's fault, not yours. Don't battle with an article which is too difficult. Check for replications. Find out if there are two research articles which are confirming each other. That's really important. If there are two which are contradicting, then it's up to you to decide which you feel is the more relevant and feasible for you. Check for applicability to your teaching. Does it apply? Does it seem relevant to you? If it seems completely irrelevant, skip it. If it seems relevant, read carefully and think about how you can apply. And draw your own conclusions. You are not limited by or constrained to accept the conclusions of the writer. You can accept them, you cannot accept them, it's up to you. You have the power to decide whether or not you will accept the implications that the writer has suggested. Finally, practical tips. This is something which we can do for our teachers, which is really helpful. Check the topic, look it up on the internet, Google Scholar, just type in you're interested in teaching vocabulary, type in teaching vocabulary, see where it takes you. Look for particularly the overviews. Very often the most useful thing that a teacher can read in the limited time at their disposal is the overviews, the meta-analyses. One particularly good journal for this is Language Teaching, which provides a lot of such articles giving overviews of particular topics, which saves teachers reading a whole lot of little empirical studies and gives them an idea of what is being said in the field in general and what the general conclusions are. Websites like this one, there are some websites which provide references and ideas what to read. Also, of course, the blogs, which I mentioned before. Webinars, conference proceedings, YouTube, all available on the internet. Finally, I don't know about you, but I read quite happily off the screen. I don't need to have it on paper. Some of my colleagues say, well, we have to print it out and read it off paper. We can't manage on screen. But if they can, and this present generation on the whole has no problem with that. If they can read off the screen, then that saves time as well. Look at, and I, as a teacher educator, will go to my students and say, these are my favorite journals, this is what I recommend. All of you probably have your own favorites. Mine are language teaching, which I was already mentioned because of the overviews, ELT Journal, TESOL Quarterly, the Canadian Modern Language Review, Study of Second Language Learning, and so on. There are several which are my favorites and which I will tell students. I'm sure that you have others which you can recommend. So to summarize then, the research literature is an important source of professional knowledge. It is not the most important. The most important is reflection on experience. I think I would accept that and give that as a preliminary condition. Most important is reflection on practical classroom experience, but having said that, the research literature is an important, a substantial source which teachers should have access to. Practitioners encounter it chiefly through their preparatory teacher education courses, but even during ongoing practice, research sources are increasingly accessible to the practitioner through conferences, the internet, and the work of people I've called mediators. And we can and should empower teachers to read the research and theory selectively and critically, and we can facilitate by providing practical tips and recommendations. Thank you very much for listening.
Standing or sitting over. Well, thank you very, very much for this talk, which I think has been extremely interesting. And I know many people here are, in fact, involved in some form of classroom research and different types of activity of that type. And I think somewhere in the room our volunteers have microphones, and we have an opportunity now to ask a few questions. So if anybody would like to ask a question, would raise their hand. Please, could I ask you, if you have a question, to make it a short, sweet, crisp question, because that means that we can have more questions. So, who would like to be the first question? There's a gentleman over here, right in the middle.
Hello. Thank you so much for such a wonderful, very well-structured presentation. I have a similar kind of presentation made in a regional conference a few days ago. I do agree with the fact that teachers must, trainees must be equipped with the knowledge of reading research articles. My point here is to tell the audience and the presenter that to enable or to empower the trainee to be able to read a research article, the most important thing that a teacher could give is to enable them to understand the research, let's say, the genre of research article. I mean, if one is able to understand the genre of a research article, I mean, no matter how difficult the text is, it is possible to navigate the text. This is my idea, and this has been, my practice.
Could you tell us your question? Could you make the...
this is the observation I wanted to make.
Your point,
yeah, okay, all right.
Yes.
We've got a question somewhere?
Yes.
Jen, Anil here at the front.
Penny, you talked about the research that is available to the teachers and its use in the classroom. I have trained a lot of teachers, and I'm now recommending them to use even ready-made lesson plans on sites like learningenglish.com or britishcouncil.org. So do you think these two can be put together to improve research and experience in the classroom? That is, there are ready-made materials, there are research theoretical perspectives and ready-made materials, and then teachers' own reflection. Do you think that would improve the situation?
Yes, certainly. I think ready-made materials on British Council websites or other websites are really, really useful for teachers. I think what teachers need is a variety of sources, such as the ones you mentioned. Then there's the teacher handbooks, there's the research, there's a whole range of literature out there, and what the teachers need to be able to do is access different kinds at different times and put them together, integrate them in order to improve their own teaching. Yes, I would certainly agree.
Okay, thank you. There's a question over here from Sally Goggin. We'll hand up right on the right. No, oh no, there's a lady. No. And the next question can be you, sir.
Thank you very much, Penny. Can I just ask, you talk about the dissonance with research and practice. Isn't a lot of this being led by research? And you talk about teachers need to have reflection. What is it that brings the researchers and the teachers together? So what drives the research, if in a sense research is leading and not hearing what's happening through the practice in the classroom? Will that gap, in a sense, between the academics and the practitioners come together? I mean, we have the same discussion really about academics and industry and how that comes together. How do we sort of bridge that gap?
That's a very, very good question, and I don't really have an answer. It's a gap, which occurs in a whole lot of different areas, as you say, in industry, and I mentioned medicine, law, and all the other areas, basically because the academics are driven by a different agenda. Their agenda is not how can we help the profession. Their agenda is how can we get published, get promotion, become famous, whatever. But their main agenda has to be what the university is demanding from them in terms of publication and so on. And therefore, it's difficult to say how we can bridge this gap. The only answer is through some kind of mediation, people like me, Scott Thornbury, Jeremy Harmer, people like that, and publishing more and more stuff which actually does try to bridge this gap. But essentially, because of the different agendas, it's difficult to see how the gap can be ultimately bridged.
Ma'am, you were talking about the complexity of the language of the research articles, and I believe that should not be an excuse for the teachers to escape from reading. So, can we think of simplifying the language of the articles so that all the teachers can understand those articles, and if they have any innovative ideas in those articles, and they can improve their knowledge like that?
Yes, the complexity of language. I don't think it's an excuse for teachers not to read. I think it's a justifiable reason in some cases because the writers simply are not making the effort to be clear enough, and they should be. Having said that, I think you're right, and one of our functions as teacher educators is to, as I said, mediate, to make the difficult articles more clear to enable teachers to navigate them. So I partly agree with you, partly not.
Okay, thank you. There's a lady here in the front row.
Ma'am, is there any research that you can recommend for us, for students who are learning without teachers, through videos and online assignments? There is no teacher in the classroom, and we are expecting him to learn English. These are tertiary level. Is there any research that I can fall back on this particular topic? Thank you.
What particular topic, sorry?
Students learning English through videos and online assignments. There is no teacher in the classroom.
Yes.
It's a classroom of about 70 students. Through computers, they learn engineering. That's the university that I work for. So I'm battling with this issue. I'm not finding good teachers. I'm a teacher educator, but I'm helpless here.
Yes, yes.
So if I don't have a teacher, I have videos of good teachers, but videos are so boring after 5 minutes, even though it's fantastic.
Fantastic, yes, but the problem is that teaching learning is essentially teacher-student interaction. And if you don't have that, because the the videos and the exercise and so on don't provide that, it's very, very difficult to bring about learning. There's no particular research I know of that can help you, I'm afraid. Maybe other people in the audience, if you know, you can come to this lady and tell her. The British Council Teaching English and Learning English websites are really helpful here. You might look up and see if there's anything there which can help you.
Or maybe we could lend ourselves to be the research material.
Or we need to interact and build up something here. Yes.
Okay. There's another question here, a lady here.
Do you think it's difficult for any teacher to really process the kind of research material that is available until and unless the teacher herself has indulged in some kind of action research within her own environment? It becomes much easier to understand what is happening in the larger world of research, unless, you know, on a very, very minor, small scale, you've done some kind of research within your own classroom.
Yes, I certainly agree that I said before that action research hasn't happened. Well, that was perhaps an overstatement, because within teacher education programs, very often, one of the things that teacher educators do is encourage teachers to embark on their own limited action research. And I totally agree that if a teacher has had that opportunity, next time I give this presentation, I must put that in because it's really important. Thank you. If the teacher has had the opportunity to do some of her own research or his own research, then certainly research done by other people becomes more accessible. You're absolutely right. Thank you very much for that.
Lots of hands here. How about the gentleman there, right next to you? Yeah.
Good morning, everybody. So I'm Satish. Ma'am, so like our India, so many countries are encouraging the question answers methods, examination methods. There is no scope in our government schools to do the research for teachers. Is it possible research in government schools, in particular Indian schools? Those the countries are encouraging the examination system only, question answers methods. They are awarding 80-90 percentage marks, but a child can't speak a single sentence in English. So how it is possible research in schools for a teacher?
Yes.
Thank you.
How can teachers do research in government schools when they're busy preparing students for exams and they just don't have time? That was your question, right? I think unless and until doing research and doing reading and so on becomes part of the job description, there's not an awful lot we can do. The teachers are overworked and very, very difficult. What we need to try to do, and I'm not quite sure how feasible this is to try to provide within the job description of teachers a certain amount of time and money for professional development.
Right. Lady here in the middle.
Thank you. I have 3 questions. In one of the limited practical applications, you said that because of small sample size, research may not be taken for wider application. So in this context, I would like to ask whether case studies can be considered as authentic or full-fledged research since they are conducted on small-size population. The next one is, what should be the appropriate sample size to be taken in order to make research more authentic? And the last question is, in some of the possible solutions, you said that teacher preparation programs should be conducted, but teachers generally show resistance towards teacher training programs, and what should be done in such cases? Thank you.
Okay, the question of sample size, even with a small sample, even with a single student, the application may not therefore be immediately generalizable or widely applicable, but these studies can produce some very, very interesting, thought-provoking results. And I think the function of these very small sample studies is to provoke thinking and wondering, and rather than assuming that these will be widely applicable. So I think there is value to, this is your first 2 questions, in fact, there is value to the small sample studies, although we have to be aware that the larger the sample, the more widely applicable it is likely to be. Your third question, remind me? Sorry? What was it? Ah, teacher resistance. Yeah, certainly there is teacher resistance. No easy answer to this one. It's a question of making the enterprise of teaching English as accessible as possible and as user-friendly as possible. And each one of us, as a professional teacher educator, will learn and learn how to make the programs as friendly as possible. I think one possible problem is that some of the teacher training programs are trying to promote a methodology or an approach which is too distant from the teacher's own experience as students, and therefore it alienates them. And what we need to do is find some kind of bridge and perhaps not go for very extreme communicative methods if the teachers themselves have learned through grammar translation, but find some way of bridging, building on their own experience and moving them towards more meaningful and communicative procedures rather than trying to push them right into the more extreme methodology.
Okay, thank you. Again, there's a gentleman over there who's been waving most vigorously. Please, yeah.
Good morning, everyone. This is Nagendra. My query is with regard to corrective feedback. Ma'am, you have said rephrasing or recasting may not be the effective thing. So how can we offer an immediate feedback when we are transacting a speaking lesson? Can you just give us some suggestions? Thank you.
Very, very good question. It's the perennial issue of my teachers, my students are talking fluently. I don't want to interrupt them. I want them to communicate, but they're making an awful mistake. What do I do? And what I said about recast, what teachers sometimes do is put in a quick recast in the middle because it's unobtrusive and it's quick. The problem is that it doesn't work. Okay, so if the student has forgotten, say, the third person S in the present simple or something, and said something like, she go to school, and I slip in, she goes, they might not even hear it. So the answer is, well, there isn't an answer. There are multiple answers here. It's a question of how confident the student is, how bad the mistake is, how important it is to correct the mistake in this context, how excited the student is about what they're going to say. When you're in professional teaching, when you're in professional practice, there are thousands and thousands of things that you need to take into account, and the decisions we make in the classroom, at any one time, we're sort of working in all these aspects and trying to make the right decision. There is no one answer here. It's not true to say that you should never interrupt a student. There are cases where it can be really important to interrupt the student to correct them, and there is some evidence that the students themselves say, I want to be interrupted, I don't want to carry on making the same mistake, particularly older adult students, but even younger ones. So if you decide you do need to correct the mistake, go ahead and do it, but not with a quick, unobtrusive recast, but stop the student, take a minute to explain and change and correct the mistake and allow the student to take it on board and then let them go back on speaking. Having said that, of course, there are other cases where you don't want to interrupt at all. As I say, it's a question of professional judgment, and never say never.
Okay, thank you. We've got time for just one last question. And, okay, last question of the day. Thank you.
Good morning, ma'am. As you said, learners of language at early age are struggling a lot. But when it comes to in India, like many of our students, or for example, like many of the language speakers, who start, their education in their elementary level of their level of regional education, and when it comes to their higher education and technical education, most of the students are struggling a lot to, grasp all language elements. But you said a statement that, students who are forced to, learn language at early age are becoming a lot stressed, and those who are learning at a later age are doing all things. But in our Indian context, it is something contradictory, I thought. So could you please explain that?
No, I think I need to learn from you on this particular point. I need to go and talk to people and hear what's going on in the Indian context and maybe amend my own ideas in the light of your experience. So please come and talk to me afterwards and teach me about it. Thank you very much.
Okay. All right. I think we'll bring the questions to a close. We'll bring the talk to a close. I give a very sincere thanks for a really interesting talk. And to you for the questions. Thank you very much.
Hello everybody, it's Anu Upadhyay. Thanks for the nice presentation. Here is some token of respect. So I would like to hand over to Pennier to this small token.
Thank you very much indeed. It's very kind of you. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed.
Chairperson Chris.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks to everybody. Now there's a coffee and tea break. And then I think we reconvene in here for the main inauguration event in about half an hour. Thank you. Well, thank you very much.